When? Oh, now? Thanks. Hi, everybody. So how do you actually legalize cannabis in Australia? Seems to be a very common question, but nobody seems to really be focusing on it. Yet there's rallies and protests, but then nobody's doing anything. We'll find out why. We'll talk a bit more about it next on This Week in Weed TV.
Well, now it's all going to pot, or whether we like it or not. Best I can tell, the world's gone to hell, and we're sure gonna miss it a lot. All of the whiskey in Lynchburg, Tennessee, just couldn't hit the spot.
Hi, folks. Lauren here from This Week in Weed TV. Yeah, it's been a while. I think one of the most common questions I get on all the sites, and I think we're probably up to around 100,000 on social media. Twitter is about 70,000, and then on the websites and Facebook groups and the rest of it, yeah, so it's probably about 100,000. So I get a lot of feedback from all over the world. I write for the Law Review in the U.S., and so I wind up talking to a lot of activists all over the world. And it is really interesting to see what people's perspectives are. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I can't talk about some of it, but it's Europe-based, and should be very exciting times if these things happen the way they look like they're going to. So what caused me to do one now is we had a bill to legalize cannabis for recreational use this week in Canberra. So, and I think the interesting issue from that is that out of I'm looking at the top 4 groups of cannabis activists in Australia, 6,000, 7,000, 17,000, 16,000, and none of them spoke about the bill. Now, the bill was crap, but it isn't that they knew that, because they supported it when it first came out, and then they didn't listen to anything, and they just kept supporting it until something else happened. It's like a little bitty magpie, something shiny, ooh, and then they move on. So anyhow, the bill was interesting in a couple of respects. There were quite a few submissions, none from the activist group that got any form of visibility or that they cared about. But then the question, of course, keeps coming up on these forums as other countries are evolving towards cannabis law reform. Well, how do you actually legalize cannabis? So I thought I'd spend a couple minutes on trying to keep this short, sweet, and pithy. The first question that I always ask folks when they're saying, well, how do we go about legalizing cannabis? Because again, it's one we get a lot. My first problem, of course, as you can tell from the accent, even though I'm an Australian now, is I wasn't born here. And that means there are certain aspects of the Australian culture, je ne sais quoi, that I don't quite always get. For instance, apparently Australians, unlike Americans, aren't such that they tend to get out and rally and support a bill. Right? But if you're going to have protests and rallies and, you know, snuff, snuff, F the police and the rest of it, there should be something leading towards law reform about that. I'll touch a bit on that. So I've got to explain a little bit about the historics, and I'll try and be quick. 6 bullet points: 1984, 2014, 2015, 16, 17, and 18, where we're up to kind of today. And then I'll talk about how we actually go about legalizing cannabis. If everybody does nothing, what's happening in the interim bit of all this is that things are going to get worse. Things are already getting worse. So I'd like to remind folks that doing nothing or having a rally and a protest in support of cannabis law reform, but actually not supporting any law reform, doesn't do anything. So I'll talk about that at the end of this, or after the points. So, excuse me, 2014, there was a Royal Commission into drug use in Australia from South Australia. It was led by a Ron Sackville, Honorable Ron Sackville, still a judge in New South Wales. He had a quote which has stuck with me since I started looking at law reform in Australia, probably around 2014, which is also a problem for me, but anyhow. Australia is misinterpreting the UN Single-Use Act. It's not about medical or personal use, but about trafficking, and should be legalized, regulated, taxed, and made available ASAP. 1984, ironically, as that is. That suggestion, of course, was ignored by government. penalties were increased, and the benchmark of what was trafficking got lowered. So it was this amount for that amount of charges and penalties, and now you only need this amount. And now it's down to about 10 plants for it to be considered trafficking. And that's a huge concern for those that can grow. I've never ever, I've been in law reform and a patient for well, over 40 years. I've never been able to grow a plant. Don't have the patience for it. But anyhow, my brother had a farm up in legal one up in California, so he knew much more about it than I did. So that's that. So the fact that 1984 they wrote that Australia had misinterpreted the UN Single-Use Act. The importance of that is if you look at where the laws are today, then you have Canada that has amended and ignored to some extent the UN Single-Use Act and other treaties. You know, there's a bit of hoopla going on about, oh, Canada's in breach because they're legalizing. No, it's just they're only in breach if they support the treaty. The treaty has had many opportunities to amend and update and the rest of it. And at some point in time, we're in the situation we are. So the U.S. ignores it. That's why it's illegal federally, but legal in 9 states recreationally and medically, and then over to 20 other states where it's legal in some form medically. Canada ignores it and amends it. The U.S. ignores it. Netherlands amends and ignores. And multiple other countries do various bits of the same thing. Australia hides behind the UN Single-Use Act, and that's why we are on the issue that we are. When they legalized cannabis in 2016, they mentioned and have many times, and every time the government and NDARC and TGA and ODC, the Office of Drug Chaos, every time they speak, they always make references to constitutional issues. They know they're on dodgy grounds with this, and if it was enforced, we probably find that Australia is actually in breach because we're not actually supplying cannabis for medicine or allowing it, but that's another story. Right, so that was 1984. So we had that benchmark, if you like, of where they said, you misinterpreted the act, you need to sort it out. And they thought, oh crap, well, let's just ignore it all. So we need to start increasing penalties, lowering the benchmark of what trafficking is. And that's what really happened since '84, but it really got worse since they legalized cannabis in 2016 and prior to that 2014. So 2014, what happened? Well, mothers with sick kids put pressure on the Australian government and all states to legalize real cannabis for medical use. Sorry. So they put the pressure on the government to legalize it for medicinal use. The original reports that came out of the VLRC here in Victoria was that the government expected that to impact 50% of 1% of 1% of the population. That's been used globally, and that's cut and pasted all sorts of places when they're initially looking at what the uptake of it might be. It's been used all over Australia on multiple occasions. So 50% of 1% of 1% of the general population, that's 0.305%. So if you look at that in terms of numbers times 30 million in the population, the actual number is very low of what they expected to be an uptake in interest, right? So also, it happens in 2014, because this is typical where we're up to now, is the USA cannabis industry sued the hemp industry, forcing them to admit CBD was not medical use, but has purpose. CBD is wonderful stuff, but it's not cannabis. It's not THC. Flour isn't cake. Eggs aren't cake. Milk isn't cake. Combine them all together, you get cake. You take them out, you've got flour. So they're not the same thing. So that is coming back to haunt us a little bit today, and I'll talk more about that. 2015, Australian government reference survey across Australia population, and people seem to ignore this very important survey. It was a really good survey, and across all ages, demographics, genders, made by one of the largest survey folks. And you can look at the details, should be on the slide somewhere in here. They show that it wasn't only that 305% of interest, but 94% of the population supported the use of medical cannabis for medical use. So that was mainly from the older folks, less so from the younger folks, which is quite interesting for the survey. But you could have said people that were older didn't give a rat's, and they'd offer an answer. Honestly, maybe the young ones were afraid to of the survey. Survey's always a bit funny anyhow. So that was 2015, 2016. Starting in Victoria, yay. Australia legalized cannabis for medicinal use. Yay. then defined what cannabis actually was. Boo. So that's a real problem. So the Department of Health gave birth to the TGA's sister organization, the Office of Drug Chaos. I'm sorry, the Office of Drug Control. And they're actually nice people. I disagree with their perspectives and what they're doing, but they're nice people, and everybody has jobs to do. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them. Their purpose was to put in place a framework for legal medicinal cannabis import, export, domestic use, and award licenses to those with verified legal demand. Real cannabis is left off the list as there is no legal demand, as cannabis is illegal and not allowed for any conditions but for that 0.305%. So they basically said, if you're dying, if you're on your deathbed, palliative care to some extent, and you tried everything else, then you can have cannabis. My view and the view of the community is cannabis is about living. It's not about dying. And they tried this shit back in '96 in California, and we didn't put up with it then. But this is Australia, so there you go. So in that government reference survey, 94% of the people supported cannabis for medical use. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at the reports that come out of the pharmaceutical industry, at the same time all this is going on in 2015, the survey comes out, the pharmaceutical industry usage take-ups from over-the-counter drugs as well as prescription drugs as well as exports went flat or even down in some cases. Keeping in mind that Australia produces 94% of the legal opiates, but not the synthetics. The synthetics are made by companies such as Emphasis in the USA that makes fentanyl, or cannabis as it's called in Australia government now, because that's part of the definitions that they changed. I'll come back to that. So anyhow, with the result of them legalizing cannabis in Victoria, creating the new framework, and then introducing a scenario where medical cannabis was legal, but only cannabis. Originally, it started out based on the demand from what doctors said there was. Trouble is, doctors were going to say people wanted real cannabis. So they had to change that and say, oh, no, let's take that away. Let's not make it the demand of what doctors say. Let's put it based on the demand of what the manufacturers say and the growers say is actually the demand of what's out there. Keep in mind, demand is defined as legal demand. Then you have to look at state by state, what conditions can you have cannabis for, and they're all the same, 0 or almost nothing. So then the result of that is they can only grow what there's legal demand for. Don't put the quotes up. They can only grow what there's legal demand for, which means no THC. So what the government created this new industry, which is effectively is around legal medical cannabis. Now the trouble is, by them changing the definition of cannabis, which I'll read quickly, this is in something called Clause 7, which isn't the guy that played for Munich soccer team. Clause 7 provides the meaning of cannabis product as any product that is or part of or derived from the plant of the genus cannabis, whether living or dead, a product that is intended or a product that is intended to have a substantially similar effect. You can almost argue that every medicine that's ever created is basically a derivative or trying to copy the things that have worked naturally, which unfortunately includes cannabis in this case. And then here's the kicker. Clause 7C ensures synthetic cannabis products will be included within the meaning of cannabis product for the purposes of this bill. That's so important, because it means that every story that you read, every story that's out there about cannabis, if they're not addressing what they're exactly talking about, they could include any product that comes from cannabis. And keeping in mind, cannabis is done by the genus cannabis, which isn't a genus, by the way. It's cannabis sativa L. But that includes real cannabis. That includes hemp. And of course, if it's a derivative of it, it can be isolates. So this is what goes on. So if you go to the government website, look at all the legal products and where they're coming from and what the dosages are. They're all isolates. And then the only products that are on there that are real cannabis, surprise, surprise, aren't actually able to be accessed in this country because it cannot be imported. So if you phone the TGA and say, aha, I'd like to get this product from Bedrocan, which is real cannabis. But then I speak to Bedrocan and they say they're not allowed to import it into Australia. So what the ODC did is they put a notice up on their website which says some of these products may not be available in your country. or aren't available in Australia. Some of these products are not available in Australia. Why is that important? Well, if somebody was to come in and say, you know what, the United Nations says people shouldn't be prohibited from having access to medicine. We've got it on our website, dude. You can have all the access you want to it. You have to fill out all this paperwork that nobody can fill out. And then once you fill it out, well, we may not be able to get you that product. Well, we'll be able to give you something just as good from one of these companies like Tilray or GW Pharma. We'll give you some real fake, real cannabis medicine. And then the worst bit of it is 99% of the stuff that's on there, if you're coming from the black market using real cannabis oil, where you may be on 1 gram a day or 2 grams a day if you've got cancer, 0.5 gram a day if it's epilepsy and the rest of it, and then all of a sudden you go into pharmaceutical medicine that's not real but acts like the other stuff, but the dosages are so low that you go from a dose of 0.5 gram a day to where you're getting a 30th of a gram a day, which means you would need 30 of these bottles to get 1 gram, or 15 of those bottles to get 0.5 gram. Then all of a sudden, if this product is on the market for $400 a bottle or $350 a bottle, now all of a sudden you're talking $11,000 to be able to get that same medicine that you are able to grow in your backyard and make yourself for free, or even buy from the black market. So what the world has realized is that if you're going to make cannabis legal for medical use, then that needs to be the same product that people are going to get for the black market, and it needs to be at a competitive price. And the only reason people are going to get it from the government is what? If the quality is guaranteed and measured. We have no testing in Australia, so nobody knows exactly what they're getting. How much this do I do that, do this? Nobody knows, because nobody knows what they've even got. And I know from dealing with customs and AFP recently for a client, is that there's so much fake CBD oil and hemp oil that's got crap in it. It's not even CBD oil. It's hemp seed oil that will say CBD oil because it's coming from hemp. One can assume there's CBD in it, and that isn't the case at all. So there's so much of this stuff being imported. People are really getting so much crap out there. And this is why, unfortunately, a lot of people are saying, well, you need to grow your own. But then we have another problem. So then 2017, where are we up to? So New South Wales Labor introduced a bill in the lower house to legalize cannabis for medical use, but it got ignored by all the activists again. 6,000, 7,000, 17,000, 16,000, and all these activist groups just in Facebook alone. So a lot of them are dead, a lot of them are in the same groups, but those are the numbers that are out there. They didn't support it. A couple of them came out and said, oh yeah, that's a good idea, bye, what's next? You know, and then somebody gets a parking ticket, and all of a sudden that's much more important than legalizing cannabis for the rest of it. And folks will call me out on that, but again, we just had a bill this last week legalizing cannabis for recreational use in Australia. Everything they're talking about going to Canberra to support a bill and support law reform, and here we have a bill in Canberra, and nobody's even flicking paying attention. So there you go. That's our activists for you folks. And this is why we have to do things differently, you know. So 2017, New South Wales Labor introduced the bill in the lower house to legalize cannabis for medicinal use, but it was ignored by all the activists, as I mentioned. The same bill got introduced into the upper house, where it currently sits mothballed because they don't want to waste the bill when the activists are not supporting law reform. There was a severe miscalculation by Labor, I think, that they didn't get involved enough in supporting the bill, but there is also a mindset, and if they had asked me and others, if they had said, hey, we've got a bill here, we're going to legalize cannabis, would the community embrace it? If you'd have held a gun to my head or bet me $1 million, I'd say, of course they would. You know, why would you have, what's that, 30, 40,000 activists in Facebook alone? Why would you not get anybody supporting the bill? That's just crazy talk. They didn't support it. They criticized it. There wasn't enough in there on the detail that they felt that they could support it, but not enough to even discuss it, not even enough to support amendments and even pursue it. So there's no credibility from the activist community at all on any of this. So that was 2018. So now that was 2017, 2018. Recently, there was a series of stories, and nobody really connected the dots, and I didn't really care enough to keep reminding people how obvious this is. Those of us that were talking, we all saw it, but anyhow, nobody cared. NDARC got out there, and Lambert Initiative declared cannabis was not working for pain. What was this based on? Well, of course, the quick thing that the Lambert Initiative came out and says, oh, well, they were testing all sorts of crazy things. They could have been sniffing paint off of this. And then one of the best stories was they were probably trying some of that Australian weed that had THC in it rather than CBD. Because as the Lambert Initiative has told us on video, is that cannabis in Australia is defective because it doesn't have CBD in it. So what they need is to do is to use some sort of synthetic cannabis or pharmaceutical cannabis from GW Pharma specifically for something like Sativix or Epidiolex for CBD. And then we'll start growing all this new cannabis that's defective in Australia and growing it that's got no THC in it legally, but is high in CBD. Trouble is, on Earth, and including the United Nations, US, Canada, and the rest of it, any cannabis that you grow that is high in CBD and doesn't have THC in it, the UN and others and everybody else in the world defines that, well, really even Australia, defines that as hemp. So it's really quick worth mentioning the hemp versus cannabis story. These days, hemp doesn't have CBD in it. Cannabis doesn't have CBD in it, but in very small amounts. The predominant cannabinoid of 110-ish cannabinoids in cannabis and 400 other elements. The top cannabinoids in cannabis is THC, and then the CBD is a very small amount. So the UN and the world really defines cannabis as 10% or higher THC, and then low or even no in some cases CBD. That's why the whole issue of making Rick Simpson oil, RSO, and FICO came about, was because when you got 15% THC with 1% CBD or less, and then you turn that into oil, it actually intensified and concentrated, that's the word, concentrates, that medicine. So where you had cannabis that may have been 10 or 15% THC, you could get that 60, 70, or 80%, and where you only had 1% CBD or 0.5% or lower than that, then you may get 1 to 5% CBD. So you don't need a lot of CBD, and that's the whole point. Even today, where people are able to benefit from CBD, you don't need an awful lot of CBD. You do need a good amount of THC, depending what your condition is. Whether it's epilepsy, you don't need as much, or if it's cancer, you need more. And then people are dealing with the issue of being stoned. Well, in that case, don't heat the oil, and then in which case, then you've got other ingredients other than THC that's in there. But then if you got hemp, keep in mind, as I said, hemp isn't actually got high CBD in it. 90% of the world's hemp doesn't have high CBD in it. CBD is a cultivar and a strain and an effect that people have grown into it. You know, you take, and this is why the other problem you have is that people say, oh, well, we have this hemp and it's 100% full extract cannabis oil, and by the way, there's no CBD and there's no THC in it. Well, how can it be full extract? Well, because that particular strain didn't have CBD or THC in it. They don't tell you that bit. So it can still be full spectrum cannabis oil, but if there's no THC and no CBD in it, or whatever those ratios are, it's got no bearing on it. It's just a word. When you talk about RSO oil is always full spectrum, high THC oil. So that really kicks back to where we were up to in terms of the history. So you can understand in 2016 they legalized cannabis, they redefined what it was. And then you have bills that come out and nobody supports it. Now you have a bill that comes out and still nobody supports it, even talks about it, even if it's a crap bill. Those of us have to pay attention to it because anything can happen these days. And to listen to this in the Senate, I encourage you to go listen to it. There's some interesting conversations, but you can also hear the rhetoric. You have one guy from the Australia Federal Police who's retired after 33 years saying, you know, we got it wrong. Everybody knows we got it wrong. It's not, you know, it's just how we deal with it now. Quite sensible, quite well presented and thought through. And then you have the current AFP. No, well, you know, I have to refer to the submission. And the submission was, you know, any submission that the AFP and the government does on cannabis, it's literally, you know, cookie cut out, and let's just change a couple of words around. And some of the words they use, which is very interesting, you can take just some of these a little bit more obscure words, Google them and put a .gov.au at the end of it, and you can find other submissions the government's done where they've literally cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste. And you go speak to an anti-cannabis MP, and quite often you'll say, well, why are you against cannabis? Well, it causes schizophrenia. Oh, God, that old one again. Yeah, but, and people under, brain damage, it causes cancer. It's like, okay, NDARC 2016, submission, cannabis causes cancer. Right. Cannabis causes schizophrenia. You're referring to the Harvard 2010 information. That was a bogus report that got corrected in 2014. It just so happens that the government keeps using the 2010 version and quits paying any attention to 2014. Listen to some of these submissions they talked about. They're even referring to references to documents and things from 2007. So dog years are 7 years, cannabis years are 10 years. Because cannabis didn't get legalized in 2016, or sorry, 1996. So when they're referring to research from 2007, there was nothing going on that was pro-cannabis until 2014 to even get to that point, because it wasn't really until Canada was 2001 and that period of time. The other thing that comes up occasionally is, why are we in this mess? Why are we fighting pharma, and why is pharma dominating the scenario? And I'll give you one interesting point on that. I'm going to talk after that about how we go about legalizing cannabis. So the problem that we've got is that because cannabis got legalized in '96 in the U.S. and then 2001 in Canada, in '96 there was no pharmaceutical cannabis. Pharmaceutical cannabis didn't come along until years later. So when we were trying to legalize cannabis in '96, it was a really for side effect of AIDS, and this was from the cannabis, from the gay community, the pink dollar, if you like, in California in '95, '96. So this was around treatment for AIDS. It was still the era of AIDS. And then we had an awful lot of opposition from the cannabis community that wanted us to remove prohibition, and that had failed already. So what I say we, I was a really small fry in all this. I wasn't anywhere near involved at the upper echelons. I was just one of 10 million people involved in California's vote to support or go against cannabis. It was very close, 50-50. So that there was no pharmaceutical industry. It was tobacco, alcohol, and then religion was in there, but no pharmaceutical. There was nothing to compete with, and there was no view that was as good. They thought it was just a recreational grab, and there wouldn't be any pharmaceutical use. One of the things that came out of that, which is quite important to think about where we are today as well, and this is one that is a good takeaway from this. Prior to law reform legalizing real cannabis for medical use, everybody is a criminal, and everybody's a recreational user. That means that 100%, because there's no legal market, 100% of this recreational market, which is the entire population that smoke, is all getting their product from the black market. You might be that black market. I might be that black market. Was it me? Or whomever. In the days of just regular cannabis being the issue, then the guy that you're probably buying weed from was just growing some for himself and selling some for you so he could offset and make some money to keep growing what he was doing. When they legalized in 2016, this all changed, because now you had some people that, I'm sorry, the point I was going to make before was when you move from everybody being a recreational smoker, because there's no medical cannabis in '96. One of the arguments we put forward, and my bit and a little bit of this was some analysis and things, but one of the things we realized was that when you go from everybody that's using cannabis, recreational or medical, when you go and make it legal for medical, then those in that stack that now have a legal access, you can't buy it recreationally. You got to go to a doctor. You got to get it medically. Those in that pile being, whether it be 30% or 50%, that's a huge impact on the black market. I mean, it was the first time we really saw that the cartels in the U.S. really start to get a bit concerned, and things happened because of that, because they went from basically being everybody buying from the black market to 30 or 50% of the people could buy from legal dispensaries, and that hurt the black market and the rest of it. That was the whole reason they legalized in Canada when they eventually got through the lawsuits, to say that, you know, if we're not making this available to people, they're going to go out and get it anyhow. The trouble is the black market's going to thrive. Yes, we're missing out on the tax dollars, but you don't know the quality is of that or the rest of it. So that was kind of the catalyst for the whole thing. So that was 2001 that they legalized pharmaceutical, 2001 that they legalized in Canada, and by them moving from recreational to medical users, now all of a sudden we had a population where the black market was going to be hindered. And you know, the U.S. made some mistakes. Of course, it was '96. It was the early days. And, you know, every state that went after that, the 9 that do recreational and medical, or the 25 or so that do medical only, they got better and better as they went along. So that was the concern. So that's why it's different in Australia than it is here. We had the pharmaceutical industry to compete with, tobacco, alcohol, religion, political. Pharmaceutical industry, 54% of the opiates in the world are made in Australia, and their main competition is real cannabis and synthetic opioids, and we know how crazy the synthetic opioids are. So how do we move from all this bullshit, all this rhetoric, all right, all this shit has happened, where are we up to, how do we legalize cannabis in Australia? It's actually quite simple, and I think that's why it's so aggravating, and some of us are still dipping our toe in it so much, is that it isn't that far-fetched. If nobody does anything, there's a pretty good chance cannabis will be legal in early 2019. The reason being is that Labor has a pretty good chance of beating the Liberals in New South Wales, the coalition, when the election takes place in early 2019. Anything can happen. Nothing's a guarantee. People still got to get out there and vote. But the hope is that Labor is going to make cannabis law reform part of their mandate, because they've already got the bill sitting there, and it could be a first 100 days sort of thing. It isn't a matter of, okay, let's go out and draft and research. It's already sitting there. So there is an opportunity that if they were to make that part of it, and that's always been discussed. Adam Searle that did the bill, him and I discussed that when the bill first came out to the lower house. I said, what's your real game plan here? Because your numbers don't support it in the lower house. The numbers don't quite support it in the upper house. Where it is in the upper house at the moment, the votes are 24 to 18. So that gives us a 45% yes vote. So you'd have to have people cross political lines in New South Wales. So that means that they've got to wait until the election comes around, and that's probably when they'll legalize. So what do you do in the meantime? So the bill that they introduced in 2017, 2018 is only 20 pages long. It's what they call a framework bill and an enabler bill. So, for instance, it doesn't say we're going to address how you're going to get access to it, but you can buy it from the black market until they fix that access. That's an enabler. So I'm not going to go too fast on that one. So you're allowed to buy from the black market. The intent of that is it then forces the health secretary, which at this time would then be Labor, or now Liberals, it forces them to then address how you're going to get that product. The trouble is, and the other thing it does, there's 2 other important bits of this bill. One is when they actually looked at what doctors wanted to do that supported cannabis for medical use, real cannabis, not pharma, they didn't want to script it, or they couldn't script it. This is another important one. The doctors can't script it because the AMA is against it, the Australian Medical Association. They've said if doctors do script it, if there was anything to script, then the onus is on them in case something goes wrong. Well, that becomes an insurance issue because the doctor's not going to take on every patient's well-being as part of their livelihood. So then the insurance becomes an issue, because if it's not supported by the AMA, then the insurance winds up being impossible or very expensive. So doctors are against scripting. So the New South Wales bills, for instance, says no scripting. Basically, you have an existing condition, which they're on this list. If you've got that existing condition and you go in to see your doctor for that existing condition, you don't have to say, oh, by the way, I'm using cannabis. Can you tell me if I have one of these existing conditions? You know, common sense applies here. If you've got, in my case, I've got neuropathic pain from years of martial arts stuff and then get hit by a couple of cars. Cars always win. I've got some residual back and lower pain problems. If that neuropathic pain wound up being covered by it, I've already been seeing my doctor for years with neuropathic pain. It's on my sheet from the doctor. I've got it. And then all of a sudden, guess what? I can go and buy from the black market. Now, you know, some of that gets a bit fuzzy. The guy that's selling it to me is still breaking the law. I'm still breaking the law by buying it, but it's almost like the Amsterdam coffee shop scenario. But as soon as I have that in my possession, I'm in my house, because you can't do it in public, then I'm safe. So, yeah, it sucks, but that does enable a lot of other issues. So it's an enabler bill. 20 pages, worth a read. Watch the video. If you don't like it, get an MP on board and say, well, we don't like it for these reasons. Great, make an amendment. Well, there's too many of them. Well, great, make your own bill. It's too important to be ignored. And when Adam presented the bill in 2018, he said that. He said, look, I shouldn't be doing this. I'm in the opposition. You're the government. You should be doing this. If you don't like the bill, amend it or do your own. But don't do nothing. Of course, everybody's doing nothing. So how do we change the laws? So my mentor, one of my mentors when I started doing this in '96, and I was blessed to catch up with him in the Denver Cannabis Cup in 2015. Keith Stroop, one of the founders of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. See, they still use the M word, so get over yourself. Build a bridge, buy some Lego. His view was quite simple, and I saw him in 2015, and of course it's very different between 2015 and '96. So I said, you know, what do we do in Australia? We got this really apathetic activist community. You know, I and others struggle to motivate them to do anything. Shot of whiskey here. Oh, nice tea. And his message was pretty simple, and it's trying to stick with me, and I try and articulate this, and I guess I could do a crap job of it because I seem to be loved or hated out there, is that every time you have a protest, every time you have a rally, every time you have an event, it should always be about law reform. So we're having a protest, snuff, snuff, change the laws, F the police, which I don't believe in either. But if you're not supporting something that's going to change the law, what do you expect the end result to be? Well, we're just having a protest. I had this conversation with somebody in hemp recently where I was saying, but you guys aren't supporting the laws. And said, oh, well, we don't have a state party. We're federal, so we'll have a protest vote. Oh, and I just suspect, but fuck that, you know? Make your vote count for something. If you've got... 7,000 in hemp? If you've got 7,000 people in Facebook on hemp, and I've been sent the databases and everything, and you know, there's a lot of people there, then why not have a clear message of how specifically you're going to change the law? This is what came out of Keith Stroop. Make every protest rally about a specific bill, not just change the laws. That means nothing. Have a bill, get somebody to get a bill, have somebody say, well, if we get a protest or a rally or a petition, will you do a bill? Don't just do a petition and hope, oh, look, here's a petition. You have to legalize cannabis now. Fuck off. You know, that's what they're going to tell you. Cussing a lot, sorry. Because I don't really cuss. So that isn't going to work. So what you've got to do in the U.S. and in Canada, if you don't have a bill, you can do a small legal challenge. You know, the whole thing around driving. Somebody could gauge the issue of how much would it be to raise a small lawsuit about the fact that the drug tests are about detecting something in your system as opposed to impairment. The laws have got nothing to do with impairment. That's worth a legal challenge. Well, what's it going to cost for legal challenge? $10,000 maybe? Just throwing out a number. I got no idea. So we have a crowdsource fund for that $10,000 for that specific legal challenge, not to go allow people to go traveling around the country and getting high in other states and saying, oh, well, I'm going to talk to you about cannabis. Well, F that as well. I'm talking about specific legal challenge to change the law. And you don't need many of these. I mean, in all fairness, if you had one protest or one rally where people are crowdfunding a legal challenge to challenge a specific law, keep in mind we've got a bill. We've got a live bill in New South Wales that all anybody has to do is in New South Wales. I'm in Victoria. if we had support in Victoria from anybody, then you could take that bill and say, here's the bill for this, can you amend this? But you got to have an MP that supports law reform and has the same common sense approach that Adam Searle's got in New South Wales. Otherwise, people from Queensland and WA and Victoria would be supporting, and Tasmania, sorry guys, wouldn't be supporting a bill in New South Wales. The view is that bill probably makes the most amount of sense. If people got a little bit behind it, then at least it would have momentum going from state by state. And then all you got to do is have any MP in any state talk to the leader of the opposition in the upper house in New South Wales and go, hey mate, I like your bill. Can you work with us or help us or get us the template so that we can cut and paste it for our state? There you go. That's how law reform could happen. So how do you do all this? Well, we produced sheets for the upper house. I remember I mentioned to you before that the numbers were 45% for and 54% against or on the fence in New South Wales. You got the Greens and some of the independents that have already said they'd vote with Labour, and then Labour, and those are the fours. And then you've got the sort of Christian ones and the ones that are anti, and then the coalition in New South Wales, which is the Liberals and the Nationals. Those make up 55%, and the Labour with the others makes up 45%. This is how I say, if nobody's crossing the line, then we've got 45% of the vote. This is why Labour hasn't come out to do the bill, because even if it was 49 to 51, nobody's going to cross political lines for this. So that's the problem. So the bill is mothballed until the New South Wales election, which was always the plan, really. And that looks like it's going to be early 2019. So what do you do in the meantime? The trouble is that isn't that far away. You know, we're into August. If people were smart, people want to legalize cannabis for real use, what they would do is they'd get MPs on board, primarily Labour, and quite often there may even be opposition, because in my best results in Victoria, where it was a Labour government, was working with the Liberals. When I put in the amendment in 2016, I'm starting to realize what I thought they were going to do. It was a guess, but I was right. You know, I couldn't do much about it then. That was with the Liberals, even though I'm not a Liberal fan. And then because in New South Wales it's a Liberal government, in this case then it was working with Labour. It just so happened Labour's got the bill and Labour's pro behind it. Bill Shorten supported the bill in New South Wales. Luke Foley was the leader of the lower house. Adam is the leader of the upper house. Adam wrote the bill. He had a family member that benefited from cannabis when they are dying of cancer. So he gets it, he understands it, and that's what he's trying to help and support. The bill's only 20 pages. It's worth reading. The video's a little bit longer, but it's worth getting an idea from. So if people wanted to move forward, what you would do, state by state, is who do you want to talk to? Everybody's available. It's a job for keyboard warriors, really. Go out and see your local MP if you're brave enough and comfortable enough doing that. Not everybody is going to be, but some will be. If you've got a sick kid or you're sick yourself and you want it for medical use. And how do you start this conversation off? You send them an email and you tell them you want to come by for a visit. Tell them that you've been watching the cannabis law reform bills that are going on in New South Wales, and we want to know what your position is on that. So it isn't coming from this position of, well, I smoke weed every day, and I just like to know what I can do to get free weed, please. May not be too beneficial. So a lot of people do have problem making, and I did too, I have to admit. I had problem talking to my MP for the first time because I had this view, and I have had MPs tell me, including Adam Searle, nobody's ever gotten arrested for going to see their MP. That's true, but there are so many people getting arrested for it that people are concerned, and this is why we need to, you know, how do you speak up? And this is a real problem. How do you speak up against something that's illegal? I'm sure they had this with prohibition as well, but this is 2018. How do you speak up and support something that's against the law without sounding like a criminal? Because you are a criminal if you're using it as a patient, if you're using it for your kid, or if you're using it recreationally, if that's what your thing is, then you're a criminal. So it's very hard to go, but if you're starting on the process, it's like you know there's this bill in New South Wales. This is a good reason why to get acquainted to the bill. And I'll put some information out, some letters, framed letters you can send to your MP. I've been following the law reform in New South Wales. The bill seems to make sense. I support medical cannabis because I've got pain and I don't want to use opioids. My kid's got epilepsy. Nothing else seems to work. Yes, I'm aware that when Australia legalized cannabis for medical use in 2016, they put in a lot of red tape that makes it possible to get. But those products that are available on the list, the ODC list, 2018, those products aren't real cannabis anyhow. So what's your position of how we evolve this? Would you consider looking at the New South Wales bill? Maybe even take in the red, I support the New South Wales Labor bill. You're going to see a Labor MP in a pro or, most of your states are Labor states now. You go see them with the Labor flag saying, I support this New South Wales Labor cannabis bill. You're not going into that from the situation. Look at this druggie that just walked in my door that's trying to figure out some way they can get illegal drugs. It goes from being that to political. And now you're on the same wavelength. And if you're able to email them in advance, they may not even want to see you because it's that confrontational, or they may be willing to talk about it. If you go to see a Labor MP, I haven't been lucky enough to do it myself yet, where they say, hey, this makes really good sense. We'd like to support this. Will you work with us? That isn't happening with Labor, but it is happening in other states. And there are some MPs, and there are some folks within the Labor Party in WA that are making inroads as well. So those discussions still have to take place. So if I can leave you with one thing, make everything about a legal challenge. So you can't just go, oh, let's go snuff, hate the police, and go to Canberra. But what you could do is say, look, there's this bill, and whichever bill you're going to support, or if you don't have a bill you like, and say, well, there's the bill in New South Wales, I don't quite like it, but let's use that as a framework and make amendments or skip it or kill it or whatever. But start with something. Don't just go rally, protest. It's such a, this hurts because I hear people all the time go, well, I went to this protest and there was only 100 people there. Well, it's because nobody's getting behind it, because nobody's supporting law reform. If you were doing, say, we're supporting this bill, this will allow us to legalize cannabis and start the conversations off, the rest of it, but nobody's doing any of that. So, and I have people all the time saying, oh, will you promote this? Will you promote that? Sure, well, what's the end game? Is it supporting law reform? Well, kind of. We're supporting the law changes. What bill? Oh, no, that's too complicated. Well, I'm not going to support something or promote something that nobody's going to benefit from. That sucks oxygen out of it. It's like this bill in Parliament where they're going in there and the people haven't read the submissions. They're asking the same questions of everybody. They're asking questions that they should know the answer to, the MPs, on this cannabis bill of David Lee Helms. It's just a joke. And people should be pissed off that an opportunity to legalize cannabis was totally hijacked by the inept. And the funny bit of this thing is that David's on video saying, why are you in Canberra protesting? This is a state law. And then he introduces a federal law bill, and then he doesn't really address any of that. If he was supporting the bill in New South Wales, for instance, he couldn't be saying, oh, please, by the way, I'm legalizing cannabis. Send me some money, and I want your votes. All your weeds belongs to us. But instead, they make it their own thing, because nobody's going to pay them money to support somebody else's bill. Nobody's going to vote for them to support somebody else's bill. So it's a voter and a cash grab. If it wasn't, then they would have done their research. Their questions were so bad. No disrespect, but I've had conversations with some of them. Ian McDonald was the head of the committee. He doesn't quite get it. And unfortunately the media only produces sound bites, and this is the other way you change law reform. If you did two things, every article that comes out about cannabis, remember I mentioned to you that the law changed in 2016 when they legalized it to where cannabis is no longer cannabis. That means that any story that comes out about cannabis isn't talking about cannabis unless they're specifically saying real cannabis. But nobody is, because it's illegal, right? We just had a case where Lana Lindsay went to Canada. They're the only ones in Australia that have ever gotten real cannabis, and that's because they sort of bypassed the system. They used the system, they threatened legal action to allow to use the system, then they changed the system, then they're fighting back to do it again, and they managed to do it again, but it's stupid. And that's one person, that's the only person. you know, and if the government's going to put stuff up on their website, these are all the legal products. Oh, by the way, some of them may not be available, and I can guarantee you, because I've spoken to both the suppliers, Tilray and our Dutch folks, that they can't import the product. So there's no real cannabis in Australia legally. You can SAS yourself to death, you can TGA it, you can TJB it, but you can't get companies to send it over. And anyhow, it's not addressing the population it should be. So, be as it may, every story that comes out in the media that mentions medical cannabis, if it isn't, because every medical cannabis isn't real cannabis, then all of it's talking about pharmaceutical, right? CBD isn't cannabis. CBD can be pharmaceutical, it can be synthetic, it can be isolate, and it can just be from regular hemp, but none of it's cannabis. Cannabis, by definition, according to the UN, is cannabis that's 10% higher THC. So if it's CBD and it's high CBD and you've got THC over 10%, that's cannabis. But nobody has access to that predominantly here in Australia. Few of us do, most of us don't. Those that have high CBD, no THC, it's called medical cannabis by Australia government. As soon as you walk out of Australia, it's no longer called cannabis, it's hemp. So, and then Australia has two books. Hemp, by definition, is less than 1% THC. But anything used as medicinal cannabis is medicinal cannabis, even if it has no THC and 1% CBD. So why would you want it? The government, if they want things to be legal and move forward, they've got to make the black market the same price, a little bit more expensive or cheaper, but it has to be the same product. So going forward, if you're in Queensland, then what you do is you get either, best place to start is your lower house, get the list of all your MPs. You can go and it'll literally take you 30 seconds. Come to me, I'll give it to you in 30 seconds. List in Queensland, lower house, split by party. That's your green zone if they're potentially for it, and those that are against it. Your greens quite often will support it, not always, but you need to find out what your MP's view of the world is. In Victoria, you could contact all of them. You know, the conversation would be different. To the independents, some of them already support it, like Fiona Patton, and Labor's against it, and Liberals are against it, and they always team up, and it winds up being 36-5 against in Victoria. So the letters there would be to Victoria saying, you're supporting the model in New South Wales, where are you guys at, or something along those lines. Every media story that comes out, we try and query as many as we can to say you're talking about this, but you're talking as if cannabis for medical use in Australia includes real cannabis. You know it doesn't. The media lies. The media does sound bites, and they've told me in the past that truth is for bloggers and activists, and journalists focus on the story, whether that be sound bites or words, and they don't fact check. So that bothers me. I don't know how we get by with that, but that's the way it is. You put a complaint into the media ombudsman, and it takes about 2 years to get a response back. Seriously, that's how big their backlog is, and there are a lot bigger issues than the fact, oh, they're lying about cannabis. Matters to us, doesn't matter to the media ombudsman. They don't give a rat's ass. So focus on every news story. Send your letters to your MPs. If it's Labor, you can refer to the New South Wales bill. If it's the other parties, remind them you legalized in 2016. You don't have to, you know, one of the things I've been trying to do is change the tone of this being so negative. It's hard to do sometimes, but because we repeat the same thing over and over again. The easy way of putting it forward, and again, I'm going to put up some letters for this myself that I've been using, is the government legalized cannabis for medical use in 2016. That was only for pharmaceutical products. The products that are on the ODC list vary from a 30th to a 100th of a dose of normal cannabis, and they're not even real cannabis. So the thousands and thousands of dollars, and you're starting to see these stories finally coming out. This medical cannabis that costs $400 a month per bottle. You may need 10 bottles of that. Well, that's $4,000. Yeah, that's $4,000 a month, not $400 a month. The Sativix, GW Pharma, when they were here talking about it. The problem they found out with it is it's 1/10 to 1/15 as strong as real cannabis. So guess what the problem is? People are using 10 or 15 times as much as they should do, so that they can get benefit from the sativas. Nobody's really complained about that, but of course it makes your costs go from $1,600 to $16,000. So that's the situation we're in. So every story you read in the media, I query them all. So I've had people say, "Oh, what a great story they did about so and so." Yeah, but he's talking about cannabis being legal since 2016, and now nobody can access it. That's not true. Pharmaceutical cannabis has been legal since 2016, and nobody wants to access it because it's crap. There's a balance of that in there, and you got to query the story. If the numbers of people going to the journalists are small, they just think, "Oh, it's just some activist nuthead." Every story about law reform or legal challenge, and you know what? The first time you do one of these, if you're going to have a rally or a protest, get a friendly lawyer on board and say, "Hey, look, how do we do a legal challenge or something that we can etch our way into this?" The challenges are, there's constitutional issues, there's the drug driving laws, there's the UN constitutional thing, as I mentioned, the Single Use Act. Are we in breach of that because we're not allowing people access to medicine? The stuff that's on the website that would allow people access isn't actually allowed or available, so that's almost contradiction of that. You've got other constitutional issues around C-109, C-117, maybe others, that says if it's legal in one state and not in another state, we've already got that situation. That's why your laws are defined a little bit there, but maybe we start out doing different things. Maybe that legal challenge is, why is it that we can have 1 or 2 plants in ACT or SA and not in Victoria or New South Wales? Maybe that needs to be one of the legal challenges. So you don't have to start on this huge grandesque stage. And the thing is, isn't you going out and do a legal challenge and spend a load of money and then trying to recoup your losses? You do a crowdsource fund for that. You do the rally and the protest and the cook-offs and the t-shirts and all of this about a specific legal challenge, a specific bill. There's so many people out there, and I just saw another guy today who he's got ex-politician, phones around and he says, "Oh, I got a list of 2,000 people in database from the cannabis community. 2,000 people phoning around asking for money for cannabis law reform." Great, I'm all in. Where do I send my money? What is it you're actually doing? "Oh, well, we're supporting law reform." Great. Exactly what law reform you're supporting. Law reform. Yeah, but are you running for an MP position? No. I've shut that down. I took all the donation money that people gave me as a political sponsorship. I put that in my back pocket, but let's just pretend that didn't happen. But now I want some new money, and I want it for cannabis law reform and other drug reform and harm reduction and the rest of it. Great, all in. What are you exactly going to do with that money? "Oh, well, we're going to fund us going and talking about law reform." So at the end of all this, after you've done all this, will anything happen? Oh, no. But I would have made a lot of money off of people. And would you like to buy one of my cool little t-shirts? Aren't they snazzy? So that's what's happening in a lot of it. And because we have so many people doing that for one reason or another, that sucks oxygen out of it as well. So if we try and focus on law reform, all the energy and all the people and all the activists and all the groups, big, small, whatever, if people are supporting law reform or a legal challenge, then everybody's got something to gain from it. We've got this diversity and fighting in the groups. Part of that is because we've got no common goal. When I was potentially going to run for a spot in hemp in Victoria, I thought, well, cool, I'll speak to see what the other presidents and the other states think. And, in a group like hemp, for instance, the top 5 focuses and priorities they have, those top 5 priorities should be pretty close to the top 3 of all of them. When I spoke to them all, nobody even agreed on what their ideology was. I started this conversation out by saying, when you're looking at cannabis law reform, you have to look at what your ideology is. And that's important. Everything I'm coming from, although I support recreational use, I go back to '96, where we said we can fight for recreational use for 20 years and may not get it. We can fight for medical use and we can get it by the hair of our skinny chins, and we may get that in a year or so. We did. It happened. Prop 215, '96, and the world changed, and now we've got 330 million people with legal access. But that only happened because we did medical first. So I go back to ideology. If your ideology is it's remove prohibition or nothing at all, that means legal for recreational and the rest of it, I got no idea how you do that. Nobody in the world has been able to do that. Portugal may be close, but Portugal won't work in Australia. Ask me when. I spoke to the people in Portugal. It's well documented. The social economic makeup of who was addicted in Portugal made it who wound up being the ones that could benefit from legalizing everything. Won't work anywhere else, according to the guy that wrote the law reform in Portugal. So that aside, every place in the world that has got legal cannabis has started with medical first. My view, my focus, until something changes it, is that has to be what it is. I asked the guy that runs the Orifice of Drug Chaos that when I was looking at the way they're setting everything up, when we set up the framework in Colorado and California and Washington and Oregon, when they were medical moving to recreational, they used the same framework Canada now. They use the same framework. So the framework they use for medical, when recreational, when it being legal, it's a duplicity. So Canada is actually coming out and saying, you know what, we don't really need two systems because everybody that's using it for medical use can benefit the recreational model if we do it right. So when I asked the Orifice of Drug Control, Drug Chaos, your framework seems to be very opposed to, it's like saying we're going to do this, but it's not that. We're going to do this, and it's not that. And that meant that now we're in the situation where you only have a very limited number of products. And I said, what happens when if they do legalize it for recreational use? And the simple answer was, that's our biggest fear. We don't want that. NDARC, the National Drug folk, the ones that put out all the comments about cannabis causes cancer and makes your eyes bug out and gives you DNA problems that you're going to have for multiple generations and all that sort of BS. You know, they're the ones that are going to keep putting out the negative words and the rest of it. So we have to get past all that. And that's how I think we do it. So everything should be talking about legal challenge. Happy to offer information on any of that. Making up a list of who you're targeting, what that conversation is going to be, and you just send out a framework email to each of them. If you aren't able to get out to see them, and again, an MP will remember when you show up with a kid and say, my sick kid benefits from cannabis oil. I've got pain. I use it to suffer from that, and I get this. I've tried all these things. If you've got an articulate story that you can offer and go see an MP, it's what changes laws. It's what happened in 2014. It's what got us to where we changed the laws in 2016, and then everybody thought, well, the problem's gone away. It's cured. It's all legal now. Let's go away. They're only part way done, and that's the story to have. The government got part way done. They haven't completed it. Let's complete the mission, and that's it. So I hope that helps a little bit. That's where we come from. I come from on this. Again, we have intermittent success. Sometimes I'll put out something and go in and put a submission in, and I can get 200 comments, and sometimes I won't get many at all. Sometimes I get comments from all over the world. Sometimes we get more activists on the cannabis law reform, the bill that came out yesterday. I had a thing on my site, and we had 7 from the US, 6 from the UK, and 5 or 4 from Australia. There's no interest. People don't even know what they're talking about. So anyhow, wish everybody best. This division we have in the community is because nobody understands, aren't focusing on the facts of the common goal. That can change. That's how we legalize cannabis. Peace.
Well, now it's all going to pot, or whether we like it or not. Best I can tell, the world's gone to hell, and we're sure gonna miss it a lot. All of the whiskey in Lynchburg, Tennessee just couldn't hit the spot.